So yeah, hi everyone that's just joining now. Welcome to the session. Thank you for coming. This is, I think, the fifth webinar that we've done in this series on mapping the way to more equitable future for education. Just to introduce the session a little bit, we're going to start with a couple of, so you can put your cameras on now, but just to be aware, this session is being recorded. So you might want to just bear that in mind if you're putting your camera on, but it would be lovely to see your faces. Currently, you won't be able to unmute yourself, so we'll just start with a couple of presentations. And then at points later on, we'll go into some breakout rooms and there'll be some opportunity for discussion, and you'll be able to unmute yourselves then. If you do want to come on and say anything, you can use the raise hand feature and then we'll invite you to say something. But also throughout the session, it'd be great to have any comments or questions that you've got just in the chat box, just as you think of them, and then we can come to them in the discussion portion of the session. Yeah, and I think that's pretty much everything. There's quite a few of you today, so that's good. Hopefully lots of great discussion. So I'm now going to hand over to Loic.
Brilliant, thank you, and lovely to see you all. Do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and say hello to everyone. It's always nice to see who's here, so feel free to drop a message in whilst I kick off. But yeah, as I was preparing this this session for today, I was casting my mind back to September 2007. So a fair while back now, but I just returned back then to the classroom for my second year in teaching in northwest London. And it was a funny moment because there was this big transformation that was taking place for me at that time. I'd actually reached the end of the summer holidays, convinced that I didn't want to go through a second year of teaching. I just couldn't face it. I didn't feel like I wanted to do another year. And I was intending to join what Dr. Sam Sims and Professor Becky Allen call an exodus from the profession far in excess of what we see in other European countries. Yet within about an hour of stepping through the school gates, something big seemed to change for me. Something felt completely different. It just wasn't the same anymore. And I knew right then that something was shifting in my mind and my plans. I was going to need to rethink my plans. And yet, actually, if I cast my mind back a bit further than that, I can actually trace that change even further. So when I arrived in the school in my first half term, I found that the pupils were completely dismissive of me. They just didn't seem to want to give me the time of day because they'd been through so many teachers. They were constantly having changes of teachers that they didn't think I'd even last till half term. So by the time I got to Christmas, I'd already started to feel like I was turning a corner. And this actually makes sense, because if you look at things like game theory and economics, you can see there that short relationships tend to lead to less trust and long relationships lead to more trust. And that was exactly what I was experiencing. What I was finding was that without the continuity that came from having a long-term teacher in that school, there was no trust between teachers and pupils, and behaviour was frankly terrible. It was total chaos. But as time went by, that changed. And my interactions changed as a result, and they gradually improved. And I'm sure so many of you who've been in the classroom will have had exactly that feeling. I went on to train quite a lot of teachers, and they all found a similar thing there, that this thing just seemed to change. And that as the second year kicked off, as I went back after those summer holidays, I suddenly had these relationships which were a source of really deep joy and a foundation of much more productive learning. And I guess the thing that was quite different was that I had a lot more institutional knowledge. I understood how the school worked. I understood what the rules were. I was able to shape my behaviour accordingly to that. I also knew the individual pupils better. I understood what made them tick, what made them angry, what engaged them, and so on. And in turn, they knew what I was like, and they'd actually adapted to that. I also had a whole network of relationships with colleagues in the school, with pupils, with their families. And actually, as new pupils turned up in year 7, there were quite a few whose brothers and sisters I'd taught or whose parents I'd met. And that changed things completely, because what it did was it gave me social capital. And funnily enough, that term social capital was first described in 1916 by a school superintendent in the US. And he said that social capital was actually centered on the hub of schools, because they were a real center for what he called goodwill, fellowship, mutual sympathy, and social intercourse. Now, the reason I'm telling you that story is because those of you who were here for our last webinar will remember that we were talking about relationships and continuity. And today I want to focus in on a particular bit of that. I want to focus in on the relationship between teacher turnover, continuity, and relationships. So to recap on the last session, what we talked about was how when we're thinking about the information we need to map our way to educational equity, it's often the knowledge that's wrapped up in those relationships and tied up in those individuals and networks that make such a difference. We heard examples of how key individuals in a community can often hold information that crosses the boundaries between different services. And we talked about how when you combine personal knowledge of an individual with robust assessment data, you can actually develop far richer understanding than you might otherwise. And we talked about how short-term funding can sometimes act exactly to break down those relationships, whereas longer-term funding and longer-term contracts and longer-term projects can build resilience and continuity and end up providing better value for money. So the obvious focus for this session would be, well, okay, how do we reduce teacher turnover? How do we get increased retention in our schools? And that's obviously an incredibly important part of it. But it's not what I'm going to focus on today, because quite a lot of has already been written on that. And one thing I'd recommend is a book by Becky Allen and Sam Sims, which I'll be mentioning quite a few times, called The Teacher Gap, which talks specifically about what we can do about teacher turnover. Whereas what I want to do is come at it from a slightly different angle. And what I want to talk about is how exactly turnover does affect relationships and social capital, and what effect that has, how that plays out, because there's some really interesting studies of this. And then I want to talk about how we can insulate relationships and that precious social capital that's wrapped in them from the corrosive impact of high turnover. But before I do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Tim Oates to say a few words here about what we can learn from some of the international and historic evidence on this. I'll then go on to some of these American studies that provide some evidence about these questions. And then our second guest, Joe, is going to talk a bit about his work at the West London Zone, which some of you might remember me mentioning last time we met in June, that looks at how and he's going to share a bit about how the West London Zone is addressing some of the issues I'm talking about. We'll then go into some breakout rooms where you can share some of the approaches that you're taking to building continuity, and we'll come back together to share those insights. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Tim to share some of those insights from around the world and from history.
Great, Loic. Thank you very much indeed. And I mean, some lovely principles, I think, and organisation of knowledge of this field in your introduction. Really, very, very good. And I think we need to hold those in mind, because I'm just going to talk about quickly an anecdote. Then I'm going to run into a bit more in the vein of the kind of principles and bodies of evidence that Loic was describing, and then mention a couple of case studies in the course of that, but I will be very quick. Imagine a sunny afternoon with Loic and I meeting outside, and we get to talking about when Finland was good. Not as it is now, because it's declining, but we were talking about when Finland was good, when they hadn't closed 2,100 small rural primaries, when participation was improving right the way across the system, including adult learning, when standards were rising and equity was improving. They had closed, if we would have closed the same number of schools in this country, we would have closed 21,000 schools. So they closed about 2,100 rural schools. These were often very small schools. Contrary to what you hear, the teachers were paid slightly more on qualification than here. They'd done a much longer initial training than here. They were paid slightly more when they started, but as they progressed, they actually fell significantly behind the pay rates in England. So although initial qualification pay rate slightly higher, in England, compared with Finland, even now, as you progress professionally, you will earn very significantly more than in Finland. I will come back to this issue of pay right at the end. Now, this is a case study. So their retention rates were extraordinary in terms of teachers. And there's this lovely biography as part of a historical study of a teacher who had stayed in the same rural primary school for 30 years. And they had crafted their lessons. They taught the same stuff year after year, but it was carefully crafted. This is entirely and they'd improved it over time. This is entirely consistent with Jim Stigler's work from Japan, how Asian teachers polish each lesson to perfection, supported by lesson study. So there's no shame in using the same lesson over and over, but you polish it, you improve it, and you know it's the thing which this particular example, this particular presentation, this particular bit of teacher performance is the stuff which works with kids to unlock their ideas, to get them to build up a particular concept. Very much a feature of the Finnish system. Teachers massively respected, relatively poorly paid, massively respected in the community, and in some ways the hub of the community, feeling very accountable. I'll repeat the anecdote I mentioned to you, Loic. In discussing accountability, this particular teacher I'm describing said, yes, of course I'm accountable to the community. If I do not teach somebody's child to read, they will shout at me in the post office. Now, this is not the kind of accountability we feel in England, highly data-driven, state-owned, but nonetheless, it's a very potent form of accountability. Now, just keep that in mind, that kind of case study. What we know is that around the world, the role of teachers is constituted very differently. I mean, we can look actually through the PISA data at the proportion of time they spend in preparation, the proportion of time they have in terms of direct content, the amount of time they spend on teachers' premises, a very long time, as it turns out, in Japan. They start very early, they don't teach much, they leave the school very late. But the crucial thing here is how you constitute the role really matters in terms of the extent to which you can retain people, in terms of the way in which the teachers see themselves in their role, and so on. So we often talk about pay and conditions, but this constitution of the professional role can be an object of policy, and in my view, in England, should be much better managed. Just for example, I mean, actually, things are not going well in France, but for a very long time, it's always been the case that behaviour problems are not seen as a responsibility of the teacher. They are seen as a responsibility of the school. That's a major difference from many systems, and it's a difference from some schools in England. Again, something about which you can have deliberate policy. Now, the issue for me, and it's a significant issue in England, is that I think teachers are loaded up with duties, and they are overloaded with duties. And when do you hear the government taking a duty away? And when do you really hear about clarity as to what is actually an absolute legal duty, which is precise and specific? What is a legal duty which is quite general and can be discharged in different ways? Well, what ways? And what is actually not a legal duty, but is being passed off by the state as a legal duty? And what really isn't a legal duty? It's just a local decision. Now, I think we need much more clarity in respect of that. It needs to be managed at the level of the school, and it needs to result in an absence of inappropriate overload for teachers. Overload is a very important concept, because if we have curriculum overload in terms of an overloaded programme, and it's something we try to address in the review of the national curriculum, if you have genuine curriculum overload, you then get local decisions about what the priorities are. At that point, you've lost control of the education system. Now, that can occur at the level of the nation, but it can also occur at the level of the school. It leads to conflicts in the teachers' minds as well. Well, I know I should be doing that, but I just can't. So I'll have to kind of pretend to management that I'm doing it and try and get away with it. That's disastrous. That does not produce an unstressed professional. It does not produce a cohesive institution, all oriented towards the same objectives. I'd add to that, I believe, and this is quite negative, I mean, there's actually positive stuff in what I've said already, which is that all this stuff can be managed deliberately. Okay, it can be conscious. I'm going to add something quite negative, though. The corrosive effect of learning models such as learning styles, differentiation, which have massively increased teacher load, to no well-evidenced educational benefit. Now, again, the EEF is cutting through this, and Loic's own work highlights where some of these things are dysfunctional, but we need to be much better at this. Teachers are still out there doing stuff on learning styles, trying to split their groups into 3. This is so far from the kind of inclusive approaches that we see in Japan, the inclusive approaches that we see in Finland, and this notion of polishing lessons over a 20-year period so that they perform really well and therefore diminish the work that the teacher load. This confusion between legal duties and non-statutory duties we tackled in a 21-school project in Wigan, Mick Walker, Graham Herbert and myself. And we looked at triple marking. We said to teachers, well, what are you doing that you think is actually of no legal and educational merit, but nonetheless you feel obliged to do it? And they said, well, we do triple marking because Ofsted actually asked for it. It's a requirement of the system, national requirement. We said, no, it's not. You can stop it on Monday if you want to. And they said, can we? And I said, yes, let's stop it on Monday. But we'll do other things instead, which have a much lower workload, but will tell you more about the kids and be more diagnostic and enable you to target individual support to kids so much better. Within 6 months, they said, we've got our weekends back. We know more about the kids. Attainment is rising. Now, this is a clear intervention which says, what are you doing which you think you need to do, but you really don't need to, and is of no educational benefit? This is a very important question. It can become a very real question in schools, and it can result in dramatic improvements. Just to finish, I mean, all systems, all high-performing systems that we know around the world have high accountability. But as I said in respect of that little anecdote from Sweden, that little historical vignette, accountability can exist in all sorts of ways and be discharged through all sorts of processes. They do not have to be mechanistic and data heavy. They don't have to result in things which the teachers themselves feel are not benefiting the kids. I'll give you a very clear, well-evidenced example of that. We clung on in this country to a national measure of student and school performance, which was 5-grade A star to C GCSEs, for over a decade longer than we knew that it was creating damage for the most able and the least able. Now, teachers knew it was doing educational damage, but they continued to comply with that, and the state continued to require it of them. And that was very damaging. It was damaging in terms of morale, in terms of management cohesion, and so on. And it was educationally dysfunctional. I think that was, I've written about this, I think it was a terrible thing to do. And if you enter a profession where you think you are being asked to do things which are not in line with your professional values, and it requires a lot of work to do them, you are going to be a very unhappy professional. And we have that evidence from other professions, such as the airline industry and medicine. And there's a lot of that in education. We ought to spot it, and we ought to remove it when it occurs. To finish, I said I would mention pay. Well, pay is important. We are above the OECD average, and as teachers up the professional ladder, internationally, the pay relatively increases dramatically in actuality and in terms of international comparisons. So why are people leaving the profession? Most of them, by the way, the ONS and DFE data says, they leave to go to either no other occupation immediately, or they go to less well-paid employment. Now, that is a very strong indicator that this is not about pay. Now, I'm not saying that pay is unimportant. I'm not saying there isn't a crisis in the cost of living. But this is about narratives where teachers say, I cannot spend time with my young kids at the weekend because I have to spend so much time on lesson preparation. I cannot spend time with my kids in the evening because I have to do so much marking. This is where, and that they feel conflicted in their professional role by the kind of things that I've described. Now, I'm not fatalistic about any of these things because I don't see these configurations of legal and non-legal duties of educational dysfunctional practice combined with educationally beneficial practice in other nations. I see them actually approaching many of the things that I've described in a very deliberate way and making sure, as in Singapore, that the things upon which there may be a high workload, but the things upon which teachers are focused, they know they are serving young people, the school, the community, the nation, the economy, and society. And that for them represents a very strong alignment of their personal and professional values with the experience that they have minute by minute in the institution. I hope that's helpful, Loic.
Thank you. Yeah, and a couple of the things you mentioned there were around continuity and polish, and then that final point about being very deliberate. And I think what I want to go on to now is to talk about some of the key findings from a few of the studies that I've been looking at recently, very recent studies that have come out that look at these questions of turnover and continuity and how they play out in schools. And I mentioned earlier on that most of these have come from the US, and the reason for that is because they rely on linking together specific pupils and teachers' data, so being able to see which pupil was taught by which teacher. And that's something we're not able to do with data in England at the moment. So that's why I'm referring mainly to studies from overseas. And the first study I want to mention is one by Michael Ronfelt, who's an associate professor at the University of Michigan. And he and his colleagues decided to crunch 625,000 pupil data points. And what they found was that turnover of teachers was indeed damaging to pupils, and that it was particularly damaging to minority, ethnic, and low attaining pupils. What they then did was look at the effectiveness of those different teachers, and they found that it wasn't just because not effective teachers were being replaced by less effective teachers, and they speculated that it was the churn itself that was harmful. And they found that that effect could be found across the whole school, not just the pupils whose teachers had left. So that raised the question of why that might be. And their view was that it was something to do with either the loss of collegiality and trust among staff, or the loss of institutional knowledge about how to support pupils, which you'll remember are exactly the kind of things I noticed when I went back to school in that second year in 2007. In a more recent study, Ronfelt then zooms into the question of staff collaboration, and he finds that there is an important link between levels of staff collaboration and pupil achievement. So you can see why a constant churn of different colleagues is going to make it much harder to build that up and to take part in the sort of lesson study type approaches that Tim was mentioning earlier on. Other researchers have also looked at this question of collegiality. So back in that Teacher Gap book, Becky Allen and Sam Sims emphasise that the importance of that, particularly with trainee teachers, when it comes to things like having a mentor who stays with them throughout their training period. They also talk about the specific opportunities that there are for people to build those collaborative relationships. Things like the traditional kind of going to the pub for a drink on a Friday night and sharing experiences of what's happened with which pupils in what lessons. So it's really important that schools create all sorts of different spaces for those types of nurturing conversations that are accessible to everyone. There are, as always with research, some notes of caution. So a more recent study by Sam Sims and John Jerem actually didn't find a link between collaboration and turnover. So it seems possible that we can still have high collaboration in environments despite some turnover, which will lead us into this question of insulating relationships from the effects of turnover. But returning for now to more of the US research, there was also a huge study in New York by Atterbury and her colleagues, and that focused in on different types of churn. So what she decided to do with her colleagues was to look at newness of teachers on a spectrum. So to think about the difference between a teacher who is entirely new to a geographic area, teachers who are new to a school, and teachers who are still within the same school but with a different pupil, different group of pupils or a different subjects. So they were looking at how new someone was. And they were saying, and what they found was that the more unfamiliar or new a teacher was, the less effective they were. And they commented that this showed that this was explained by the fact that it is more difficult to be effective at complex tasks like teaching when the task or context is unfamiliar. And so the more unfamiliar the task was or the context was, the less effective the teacher was. And that also makes sense when you go back to some of Becky and Sam's points, where they talk about how teachers have to build up a kind of mental database of past examples, and that they refer back to that when they're trying to make judgments about what to do. And the more relevant the cases that are stored in that database are, the better the judgments they can make. So it makes sense that when teachers find themselves in really unfamiliar contexts, and there's even less continuity, it's even harder for them to be effective. And this is really important because it leads us to the question of how we allocate teachers to pupils. So how we match teachers and pupils to make the most of the benefits of familiarity. Because this really matters for equity, which is the main focus for this kind of series of discussions. Because as I said, lack of continuity particularly affects disadvantaged pupils. And on top of that, it is disadvantaged pupils who are most likely to have churning teachers or new teachers. Not just because levels of turnover are higher in schools in disadvantaged schools, but also because even within the same school, it turns out that the disadvantaged pupils are more likely to have new or unfamiliar teachers. And you might ask yourself why that is, but it kind of makes sense thinking back to my time in school. I know that people who were established teachers would be able to almost lobby to be given the classes they wanted to teach, their favourite classes. And unfortunately, quite often the favourite classes are not necessarily the most challenging classes. So that means that it's often the new teachers who end up lumped with the less desirable classes. And if we want to map our way to educational equity, it surely makes sense to think more about these teacher allocations, whereas we quite often just think about new interventions we can do, rather than thinking about something so simple as how we allocate teachers. And that brings us to another set of US studies, which shows a really practical way of doing this, showing that we can increase continuity and strengthen relationships through what's called looping. Now, looping is a term that's used to describe teachers teaching the same groups of pupils in more than 1 year. And Sistone and Schneiderman did a study of this. They surveyed teachers, pupils, and school leaders, and they found that when you loop teachers, when they taught pupils more than once, the quality of their relationships with students improved. And that's great, but it might sound slightly fluffy if it doesn't translate into tangible impact on outcomes. And yet study after study shows tangible impact, not just on achievement, but also things like attendance and behaviour. So if the benefits are that clear, why is the practice of looping not more widespread? Well, I guess it's understandable that perhaps teachers and pupils might be concerned about being stuck with a teacher or a pupil they don't get on with. But another of the study's authors points out that actually as teachers and pupils get to know each other better, they actually adapt to working together better, so that even less effective teachers gradually become more effective over time. I remember that one of my favourite classes by the time I left teaching was actually one of the ones I had the most trouble with and disliked the most when I started teaching them. But we grew to understand each other, know each other, and find ways of working. So we can actually make less effective relationships more effective through looping. The other challenge is that the benefits of looping need to be weighed up against the fact that there are also proven benefits to teaching the same year group or the same topic several times in a row. So we clearly need some research to help us to weigh up these different trade-offs. But to me, it seems like it makes a fairly obvious case for the need to think much more carefully about the benefits of continuity when it comes to teacher allocation. So before I move on, I'm just going to ask Penelope to put up a quick poll because I'd love to know about your own experiences and whether looping is something that's done in your schools. So would you mind putting that up, Penelope?
Yep, so I've just launched the poll, just a quick yes, no, but then if there are any comments about that, you can just put them in the chat. And just to say while we're waiting for that, we did have a comment from Jenny saying, is there a problematic tension between the need for a centralised and directed approach to reducing the sort of overload of duties described and the belief in the importance of professional autonomy?
Yeah.
Probably say yes.
I think there is.
Short
Yeah.
answer.
Actually, it was interesting. Someone put there's a comment on one of the blogs I posted in the last week around this topic, also pointing out that these tensions between centralisation and autonomy. So I think that is something we always have to grapple with, and it's maybe something we can return to in the breakout rooms in a bit.
Yep.
But it looks like, yeah, from a poll, it looks like there are schools that are looping, but the vast majority seem not to. So I'm really intrigued by the fact that it's not something that's talked about more or focused on more, given that it has an unusually strong evidence base. And I actually spoke to the EEF about this in the last few days, and they're also not aware of work in the UK on this. So to me, it seems like a bit of an explored and undervalued area. Good. I'm just going to say a few more words and then hand over to Joe. But I think from this insight around looping, there's almost another question that comes up, which is how can we replicate some of the relational benefits of looping, even where we aren't having repeated teacher interactions? And that's something that an organisation called the Relationships Foundation focus on in their relational schools work. And Cambridge University Press has actually published a book on their work. And one of the things they argue is that at the moment, school environments often pull in exactly the opposite direction of the evolution of trust, and that we need to plan around some of that unavoidable discontinuity. And that means thinking more carefully about how information is handed on, how we can make sure that pupils actually have multiple trusting relationships, so that you've almost got a rope with multiple strands. And if one of those strands is cut, it doesn't mean that the whole thread is lost. And that could bring us back to some of the themes we talked about last time we met around the role in secondary schools of form tutors and heads of year, and the opportunities for them to stay with a year group over time. But it also links to the question of deploying other professionals from outside the school in new ways, which is why I've asked Joe to come in to say a little about how the West London zone does exactly that. So over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Loic. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. Yeah, hi, and yeah, really interesting to listen in. I mean, I'll mention three things just very quickly. Just first of all, very quickly, what we do, and then specifically about how we prioritize the building of relationships, and then finally why that's important. So very quickly, I mean, we're a charity. We operate a schools-based early intervention preventive support model. We base one of our link workers full-time in 55 schools across 4 boroughs in West London. They deliver and coordinate a 2-year early intervention preventive support program with cohorts of children. These are sort of roughly around kind of targeted early help, CIN, SEN support level, multiples, disadvantages going on, let's say, and we're working to outcomes in social, emotional, and academic areas. The link worker based in each school is clearly the key behind this. You know, they manage a support plan that they design with parents, the children themselves, with teachers. We bring in different specialist partners, therapy, tuition, and also link them to stuff in their local community. But I think at the heart and the backbone of this is the trusted relationship, the 2-year relationship between the link worker, the child, and the family. So how do we go about that? I mean, the first step really, even on the initiation of it, and there's a parallel to one of your points in your blog, Loic, we make sure we use the kind of institutional memory of the school to make sure that when one of the kids has been proactively identified for the program, we try to prescribe the person in the school who has the best relationship with the family, whether that could be a TA, it could be, you know, a particular form teacher, that they are the one that makes the introduction to our link worker. You know, we want the first sort of introduction to be the most successful. And then how do we develop it? I mean, we're full time in most of the vast majority of the schools that we're in. So the, you know, visibility, feeling that sort of sense of constant presence at the school gate in the morning, at drop off, lunch hall, you know, looking out for them in school every day is a crucial thing. I think what we've learned over the years, spending almost that entire first term to get to know them really well before kind of rushing in to deliver stuff. Let's get interventions going, let's get stuff going that's going to help. We want to get to know them really well first of all, and then involving them and the parent in the creation and iteration of the support plans, making sure there's stuff in there that they want as well as stuff that they need. There's a bunch of other stuff around, celebration of achievements, regular communications home to parents, their, little and often text messages, letting them know how they're getting on. I mean, I think when I sort of list these things, really, I mean, it's not rocket science. It's not a kind of silver bullet that we've got here, or they're not new interventions, as you were just talking about, Loic. They're things that just need time and deliberate intention, I suppose. And the sort of rest of the program flows from there. Couple of points finally on the sort of why we found this to be, why these relationships have been important. I mean, obviously they have a sort of therapeutic quality in and of themselves, that children and families hopefully feel, and there's evidence around that. But also, as it says in the blog, the link worker is able to bridge across home, school, different agencies, allowing children and families to feel as though the system is joined up around them. And the that even goes from within schools, and secondary schools in particular often tell us how moving certain kids between kind of inclusion units and reintegration back into the regular forms, and that's a risky time, without a professional, without a relationship sort of making that bridge really to pass on the crucial information to the other teachers. So we play a role in that. I think one of the other areas really, and this is to refer to some other evidence that we were interested in recently, the Josh McAllister review, clearly talks about the damaging effect on families, about the way they experience multiple handoffs in the system. Going from one agency to another, thresholds, handoffs to different areas. Now, obviously we can't get rid of that altogether, but having that constant relationship to sort of mitigate the ill effects of those referrals, when they're needed, we found to be important. And then I think finally, you mentioned the blog, Loic, around funding, and specifically that example of the gaps between projects and sort of short-termism in funding. I mean, we've found also that if you want to get the best out of some of the best evidence-based interventions themselves, it needs a relationship to sort of properly broker them, think them through, try to make sure that by the time they're, the child or family is engaging with them, they are properly engaged. And that communications are flowing between teachers, parents, before the intervention, after it. So, link workers play an important role in that as well. So yeah, that's it from me, Loic. Back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. It's really helpful to get that example, and it's amazing how you've worked some of this stuff through. So we're going to go into breakout rooms in a second. We've heard, these historic and international perspectives from Tim on continuity, and what we can do to reduce that turnover. I've shared some of these recent examples of research on churn and this idea of looping, and Joe's talked about this contribution that this external continuous person can play. But we're now going to move into breakout rooms so that you get a chance to share a bit about how you've gone about tackling some of these challenges. And specifically, the question for you is, how do you minimize, or how could you minimize the impact that changes of staff have on continuity, including, how you're allocating teachers and how you're building and maintaining relationships. So we'll have just under 10 minutes in breakout rooms to do that. And if we could ask each room to nominate someone to very, very briefly feed back to us when we come back together. And Penelope, if you could send us off into a rooms, that would be great. And apologies, my neighbours seem to be having some very noisy builders next door, so
it's okay. We can't hear you.
Radio, so
we can't hear that. I've just put the question for the breakout rooms in the chat, so if people just want to quickly have a look at that, and then yeah, I will open the breakout rooms now. Welcome back to the main room, everyone. I hope you were able to have some good discussions in your rooms. Loic, do you want to kick off
Yeah, sure.
leading back?
I can't quite remember your name. Was it Kate or Mrs. Spencer? I remember was your name on your label from my group. Do you want to kick us off telling what we discussed?
Oh, sorry. Let me just allow you to unmute. That's a that's that's an important part. There you go. You should be able to unmute now.
Great. Hi everyone. My name's Karen Ann. I work for Polymat in South East London, and there was some great suggestions from different people, both in the chat and verbally, thinking about kind of that idea of workload removal to create space for the relationships. And Dominic was saying about kind of people don't often think of them as important, and it's like, but actually we need to kind of centre those there. We talked about kind of actually this idea that some schools have teachers requesting classes they want to keep, but actually we should be analysing which students are most impacted and have the most changes and what we can do. I shared a couple of things that my schools do. We've just started the term with every student and family member coming in and meeting with their form tutor. So even if they've got a new form tutor, they can reconnect and build those relationships in that private way, talk about support, etc. Lots of people talking around looking at ways of building trust, like the use of kind of trips or residentials, particularly in half term 6, around that handover and transition to kind of kickstart that process. I know there's some things in the chat around timetabling constraints, and some people were saying it's hard to do for academic classes, but we always do it for pastoral, or we prioritise certain year groups. I think that was everything, but do chip in if I've missed anything, my group.
Great, thank you. You want to go next?
I can feedback from the room that was not a room. So I had Jude Glover, who was previously been a teacher, but now works for the teaching union. But she made a really good point about allowing for more flexible working within the profession, because that can help to make the profession more attractive, and it can support people staying in the profession when perhaps they have life changes, children, things like that. But what schools and maybe head teachers sometimes thought a barrier to that would be sort of buy-in from parents, of sort of maybe having to deal with 2 teachers, but as well as the benefits to the kind of individual. Actually, perhaps when you're dealing with more challenging classes, you would actually have that that build up of a support system, so you've got that sort of support of the other teacher that you're working with, and we were just saying that kind of feeds into that sort of collaboration aspect that you'd mentioned, Loic, about how good collaboration between staff can lead to better outcomes as well. So that was the main thing from our room.
Thank you. Simon, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I appointed myself chair of my particular group. So we had a few really good points actually about the question, mainly around the idea of creating spaces or opportunities to actually have those interactions between teachers. And I think Jeff in our group commented on the reduction of the role or the commonality of having places like staff rooms and other shared spaces where teachers can actually interact with each other, to have those conversations in terms of allowing continuity between the pupils, that they've often been taken up and been used for other things, which is a change that's happened over recent years. And also there was a point raised about the idea of co-teaching as well, to allow the opportunities for teachers to actually observe each other in the moments, to know how different students in different classes are being taught, so they can build on that institutional knowledge as well. And there was also this idea of having almost a toolkit or resources within lessons, and so there's a kind of a set pathway or skill set or toolkit that can be used for lesson planning and for materials and so on, to help encourage continuity from class to class and year to year. So they were the main things that were picked up on in our group.
Great, thank you. Excellent. Brooke.
I'll be really quick, Loic, I promise. Thank you. Because actually quite a lot's been covered already. So was it Kate or Miss Spencer covered a lot of what I was going to say. But also, Simon, you just touched on one of the things that was really, really quite well highlighted by the non-teacher person in our group, was just to say that actually this doesn't necessarily have to be solely put on the individual teacher. But if we had more of a social and collaborative approach to this, maybe it could be a departmental thing where actually moving from, say, your year 8 to your year 9 science teacher wouldn't have to feel like such a change because you actually would have maybe worked with one of the other teachers in the group before, something like that. So it doesn't need to feel so much like a change at that point. And then also I was just going to say from experience, the pastoral continuity that I had when I was last teaching, you took in a group at entry and you kept them for the whole 5 years from a pastoral point of view, which was incredibly useful, but still doesn't address the issue that you said in terms of lack of time to communicate with each other as a staff to then highlight these really, really vital points that you might have about some of your students.
Great, thank you. Is that everyone? Have any other groups?
I think Joe had a group as well.
Cool. Okay.
Hi, yeah, I found myself in a group of teachers from the same school in Kazakhstan, which was fascinating, actually. And yeah, and just on the looping point, almost in extremis, really, in Kazakhstan, in sort of primary school, there would be the same teacher following a class from years 1 to 4, and then in lower secondary as well, years 5, 6, 7 would have the same teacher across the piece, and even in upper secondary, by subject, each class would have a teacher follow them all the way through school. So say maths teacher, and parents apparently is a parent expectation. Parents would be complaining if there was a change in the child's maths teacher. So I mean, just interesting how there's different expectations, I suppose, on this stuff. On the sort of challenging, on the sort of challenges side, kids then adapting to a slightly different style and personality of teachers. After you've had the same person for the last 4 years or something, is sounded like more of a challenge. But yeah, it's very interesting.
Oh, great. Thank you. That's really interesting. Really nice to have that contrasting point. So thank you. Cool. Well, I'm going to start drawing us to a close, but I mean, just to round us off, we've been talking today about how, in this context of high turnover and a fragmented system, we can create this continuity. We've talked about how high turnover of teachers undermines continuity in relationships. We've talked about when that's undermined, about how we can make sure that we still maintain that information, that trust, and that social capital. And hopefully it's helped you to kind of see how we perhaps need to value that continuity a bit more. It's one of those assets that's very intangible and that therefore sometimes gets undervalued. And although, of course, stabilizing turnover is one of the key things we need to do, there is more we can do when it comes to thinking carefully and intentionally about teacher allocation, about how we nurture and build those relationships, and how we can ensure that there are multiple strands of relationships. That, as we heard, you don't just have a relationship with one person in the department. There are multiple relationships. There are those pastoral relationships, so that you've got that continuity of the thread throughout. So really helpful to have your contributions today, and I hope it's given you something to think about within whatever setting you're working in. I'm going to hand over to Penelope now to close off, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, just to echo what Loic said, thank you all for joining. It's been a really great session. I had quite a few people, and I think there's been some really great discussions as well. Also, thank you to Joe for joining us, and Tim. I'm just gonna put a link in the chat, which links to a whole series of blogs that Loic has been doing. I mean, we're calling them blogs. They're not really blogs. They're quite research heavy, research based, which is great. So you can kind of dive into those. They kind of link off to research papers and other things. So if you really want to round out your understanding of what we've been doing with our Mapping the Way project, then that's a great place to start. Also, you're probably all on our mailing list now for this particular event, so you'll be hearing about the next one, which will be happening before the end of the year. So if you want to contribute again, and just to say, like, all your contributions, they are taken into account. Loic's kind of, you know, he's listening to the things that you're saying, he's bearing in mind the comments that go in the chat, so they all kind of add to the body of thinking that we've got for this project. So that's why it's so great to have you. And we've actually finished on time, which I don't think has happened.
Essential.
Yeah.
Busy
on any of the other
people, we
ones.
don't want to waste the time. Thank you.
Yeah, but if there are any just final comments or questions, you can just put them in the chat, or yeah, just I think that's everything. But yeah, good start to a Wednesday lunchtime.
Thanks so much, everyone. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
All.
Bye
Bye.
bye.
Good day.